Hello, it's Tuesday, KZSU Stanford. This is the Henry George program. I'm Mark Molyneux. I'm joined by co-host Jacob Swartz-Lucas, representing EarthSharing.org and the Robert Schockenbach Foundation. Our show is dedicated to finding practical answers to the housing crisis, economic volatility, inequality, environmental degradation here in the San Francisco Bay Area and beyond. We compare and contrast the ideas of the 19th century economist Henry George with that of both historical and contemporary thinkers. Also addressed are issues ranging from AI, automation, UBI to city planning and the land value tax, a concept popularized by George. Today, we have Professor Jack Miller. He served as a dean of the College of Law from 1995 to 2002. He's an accomplished tax scholar who's authored more than a dozen law review articles. He's a co-author of a casebook, The Fundamentals of Federal Taxation. He holds law degrees from the University of Kentucky and University of Florida. He has taught at 6 law schools, including William & Mary, University of Florida, and the University of Western Australia. At the University of Idaho, he has received many awards for his teaching. His service to the legal profession and to legal education is wide-ranging and has included long-term service as an inspector for the American Bar Association's Accreditation Committee. Professor Miller's service affiliations have also included the Law School Admission Council, the American Law Deans Association, the Idaho Law Foundation, and the American Inns of Court. Welcome to the program, Professor Miller.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So on this program, I don't think we have to make an introduction to Prop 13. We're here in California, at least I am, and it's something that everyone focusing on the issues knows about. Look it up yourself at your own leisure. This is a bit heady if you know nothing going into it. But one thing we haven't really talked about in any depth was the fact that in a little over 2.5 decades ago, give or take, it went to the Supreme Court. The case was Nordlinger versus Hahn. And in an 8-1 decision, Prop 13 was upheld by the Supreme Court. And in 1993, there was a paper which is called Rationalizing Injustice, the Supreme Court and the Property Tax, written by Professor Miller. So I guess the first question is, what led you to kind of pay attention to this and decide to kind of make a commentary on this case?
Well, to me, this was a striking example of the Supreme Court really missing the boat. The system of taxation that Proposition 13 imposed is, to my mind, so irrational and so basically unfair that I just could not get my head around how the court could feel that it had a rational basis. I'm not a constitutional scholar, and I've talked to a number of my friends who are constitutional scholars, and their perspective was different than mine in general, although there are, with a few exceptions. But I felt like that difference in their views and mine flowed from their essential ignorance of how we measure fairness in a taxing system. And if you understand that principle of tax fairness, you would see that this is just a fundamentally irrational taxing scheme.
So to break down to what this came to in the Supreme Court, it was challenged under the Equal Protection Clause, the 14th Amendment. And yes, in the way that tiered scrutiny has worked in the Supreme Court, I guess we should talk more about that because most people listening to this may not know how this works. But there's different tiers of scrutiny. Strict scrutiny,
that's right,
is when a state has a compelling interest. Is the I guess it invites basically the burden of proof to lie upon the state. Meanwhile, taxes in general tend to only fall under the scrutiny of rational basis. The Supreme Court has taken the idea that even a bad tax, even an unfair tax, has tended not to really be their problem, and that's something that you in this paper and actually other papers you've written have criticized the fact that in your view a tax can be so irrational that it violates all principles of equity and fairness, that it should not even pass the rational basis test.
Yes, I think that any tax has the possibility for being irrational to some degree, and probably all of them are. But the difference with Proposition 13 is that it's irrational at its very core. Let me back up just for a second and note that traditionally we've called property taxes ad valorem taxes. That's from the Latin meaning according to value. And so the fundamental base of a property tax has been the value of the underlying property. And that has a certain rationality in that you're treating similarly situated people the same way. If you own property that has the same value as someone else, you pay the same amount of tax. What Proposition 13 did to that was to instead choose a different number, a number that really becomes more and more disconnected from the immediate reality as time passes, because it uses the number of acquisition cost as the tax base. And that number remains fixed over time, even as the property itself becomes worth, generally speaking, more. And what that results in is a system in which people living in virtually identical properties of identical value may pay dramatically different rates of tax. And that is just fundamentally unfair.
So you're talking about the sales price versus the actual economic value of the property in question.
Right. That's right. The Proposition 13 had several different components, and the components that were, you might say, were rational, were used by the Supreme Court in its decision to uphold the parts of Proposition that are 13 that are quite irrational. And let me explain. During the 1970s, property values went up very rapidly in California, which was causing the tax bills to go up rather dramatically as well, because the tax was computed by reference, by applying a rate to the base being the fair market value of the property. Well, Proposition 13 in part was simply a tax freeze, because what it said in part was to say that the tax rate can be no higher than 1%. And at that time, the 1% of the presently assessed value of the homes and other real estate. The present rate was over 2% for most people in California. So a big piece of Proposition 13 as originally enacted was simply a very large tax cut. But grafted onto that was a provision that said, first of all, the rate cannot go up. So it was also a tax freeze in that sense, or a rate freeze at least. And then the third piece was to say, and by the way, we're going to use this new base, acquisition cost, as the base for the tax from here on, which means that the existing homeowners and were going to get a benefit as time passed, because although their values might go up, their tax bill could not go up. And at the same time, the system would allow revenues to grow by shifting more and more of the costs of government onto newcomers. And so these different components, a tax cut, a rate freeze, and a shift in the base were all laced together. And one of the things that confused, I think, the Supreme Court was that it tried to justify the change in the base by reference to these other components, which were really unrelated.
So to satisfy the rational basis, essentially they only need a reason that is at least it passes muster as not being entirely disingenuous. And the reason they said is this offers stability for local powers to allow stability in their population. Sure, that's considered a reasonable basis, and it doesn't matter if by what means they affect this. In the case of Prop 13, it was called at the time a revolt of the haves, insofar as it basically was supported by higher income white males and people who already owned property. They voted in their own self-interest, and as you said, in some respects against the self-interest of persons, many of whom, such as young people and future residents, had no vote. Which in the
That's right.
Yeah, so in the eyes of the equal protection, you could say that the fact is even if this is a naked interest, a naked preference, as you quote Cass Sunstein's idea of something that has no basis in principles of fairness. It is just basically a grab for more by some special interest. This, even if you were to say that this kind of plurality system is advised, the Supreme Court is supposed to protect people who, don't really have a standing to really to say we can't even fight because we're not born yet, for instance. And in this case, yes. We're the people paying. I was born after 1978, and yet I feel the consequences of Prop 13. So this is supposed to be, in some legal eyes, the balancing act that the Supreme Court is supposed to make, in which they did not.
I agree with you. I think that essentially the Supreme Court abdicated its role as the protector of the minority in this particular case, or the protector of the voiceless, because this, as I've described, the way this taxing scheme was set up, everyone who was voting at the time, who was already a homeowner, was basically voting for their own immediate self-interest, and at the same time voting against the self-interest of future homeowners and future voters, you might say. And so it was very much a scheme that was not designed to fairly represent future interests. It was the immediate interests of the immediate voters, the immediate homeowners that was being represented here. And that's an area where the court is uniquely situated and suited to try to protect the overall structure of society, in my opinion. And I think it failed to do so.
So, one thing you address is the idea, is this, kind of the degree into which this was affected, or was it, basically the entire kind? Because in you make the initial, what if instead of locking down a low rate, because right now people who've had a home since 1978 pay, a very, very small percentage based on market rate. Instead, let's say that they said we should pay no property taxes, but everyone in the future should pay some property taxes. You say that this would be more likely to fail, even though it's essentially the same thing of saying we pay 0% on all accrued value to our land values as time goes on. Do you think that would be the case, that would actually violate what a rationally bad tax would be?
Well, yes, I do. If you think about it, every tax exists with a rate and a base, and the ultimate tax liability is a function of applying that rate to the base. If you make either element discriminatory, that is the rate or the base, then the tax itself becomes discriminatory. And so, for example, Proposition 13 could have been structured to say, well, those of us who are bought our homes in 1978 will pay at a rate of 1%, and those of us who buy a home in 1979 will pay at the rate of 2%. That would be a more directly, openly discriminatory scheme than Proposition 13, but it would achieve similar results. And I think that had that been structured that way, that is the rate being discriminatory rather than the base being discriminatory, the Supreme Court would have been had an easier time striking it down.
Do you think that was intelligently and methodically thought out before the fact, and you might say a somewhat malicious way to thinly veil raw political power of a majority group over a less powerful minority, or was it just happenstance that that's the way it was structured? Do you think they did the minimum that they had to do to get it passed?
No, I think it was a very deliberately developed scheme to protect the interests of those presently who owned homes. And there are a number of elements that demonstrate that. For example, Proposition 13 also contains a provision that says if you give your home to your child or sell your home to your child, your child gets to keep your assessment. So in other words, it created a hereditary right, in a sense, to a low property tax assessment. Justice Stevens in his dissent referred to it as establishing a class called the squires, kind of a reference to a more feudal system. So the overall structure of this scheme was very well thought out to appeal to the basest instincts of the present voters, because they were going to benefit on multiple levels, and the only people really being hurt, in a sense, were future homeowners, who many of whom may not have been alive or certainly may not have been voters at that time.
You could also say that all of the people who had to make up the tax revenue not acquired through a higher property tax on such owners are hurt as well. So, for instance, sales tax is paid by poor people when they go and buy food, and they pay at the same rate as rich people. So more revenue is coming from those that don't own property than from those who do. So that's another way this is perhaps you might say discriminatory or regressive.
Well, yes, it certainly had some significant potential for making the property tax a less important source of revenue, and thus shifting the tax base or the tax revenues of the government to other forms of taxation, which could be more, those other forms could be more regressive or more progressive. To the extent that you shift to the sales tax, and that's a fairly regressive tax. There is an inherent regressivity in Proposition 13 as well, because it discriminates in favor of wealthier individuals over time as well. And so think of it this way. Suppose that two people buy houses the same year, and one of them they both pay $1 million for their homes, which is not unrealistic, I suppose, in California these days. Down the road, those homes might appreciate at different rates, and let's say one triples in value and one doubles in value. So the one who now owns a home that's worth $3 million is going to pay the same tax as the person who owns a home worth $2 million. So the wealthier of the two has benefited the most from Proposition 13. And,
so it's unfair even to the people who are benefiting in relative terms. So if your property goes up by a huge amount, you get an even bigger tax break than somebody whose property only went up by a relatively smaller amount.
Yes, and in the course of it, discriminating in favor of the wealthier person. You can see that similarly if two people buying homes in the same year pay, let's say one buys a home worth $100,000 and another buys a home worth $1 million, and then let's say both homes double in value. Well, the one who paid $100,000 is benefiting in a sense because they would under a normal property tax system they would pay based on a value of $200,000 now, and they're still being taxed based on a value or a cost of $100,000. The person whose home originally cost $1 million, that is also simply doubled in value, is now assessed on a $1 million value for a home that's worth $1 million more than that. So they're saving in relative terms a tremendously greater amount of property taxes than the person who bought in the same year they did. So again, it discriminates in favor of the wealthier individual.
So to take a look at the big picture, something you talk about is the different principles of what makes for a rational tax based upon normative ideas of equity. Horizontal equity is a big one. This is the idea that people who are the same in different respects that are significant are treated the same. This is a quote by Joseph Stiglitz. So basic is the notion of horizontal equity that is incorporated in the Constitution of the United States as the Equal Protection Clause.
Yes, and that's what we pretty much thought until Nordlinger v. Hahn, at least, is that the Equal Protection Clause clause essentially incorporated the concept of horizontal equity, at least broadly speaking.
So that's one of the principles. Another principle is vertical equity, and this is more. It seems to map onto progressivity, the idea that when you have more, and in some ways you benefit more from public goods, you should pay more to make up for it. And as we see in Prop 13, we have essentially the opposite of vertical equity. The more you have, the less you pay in.
Yes, yes. I mean, the concept of progressivity is important in the idea of vertical equity. That is that as you have more resources, you should pay at a higher rate of tax as well as a higher total amount of tax. It's also based on the idea that as people have more disposable income, in particular, each dollar becomes less valuable to them than the last one. It's sometimes referred to as a diminishing margin of utility of money. But both of these concepts, horizontal equity and vertical equity, are embodiments of a kind of a very fundamental tax principle, which is that taxes should be based on a person's ability to pay. And in a system like this, where you're really not looking at the degree of wealth a person has, but simply a historic number that may have nothing to do with their present financial situation, that ability to pay concept is really completely fallen by the wayside.
And I guess to wrap up the ideas of principles, a third principle, you say even people who throw some doubt on the normative basis for horizontal and vertical equity would still look at efficiency, and the efficiency of Prop 13 is abhorrent. It does not allocate land to people well. It locks people into their homes and basically keeps newcomers out of the ability to be allocated into a city. So as far as all three of these principles, it fails all three terribly. So that the basic thrust of this is there is no rational basis for this being a tax scheme.
Well, the rationality here was the people who voted for it were voting for their own immediate self-interest, and that's where the court should have been stepping in to be looking out for future generations and for future homeowners. You know, there are some twist to Proposition 13 that are interesting, but the point you make about the lock-in effect, that is that because once you buy and you get that low assessment, you're not going to be inclined to sell and buy again because you're going to your property tax assessment is going to jump. That is a significant factor in pointing out the irrationality of the tax, because generally speaking, in our society, we actually try to foster mobility of people. We try to, in our tax system and in other ways, we try to foster people's ability to move from one place to another in order to, take a new job or to make some other change in life. And Proposition 13 really has a lock-in effect, causing people to stay in the same home even when they might want to move. It does have one discriminatory feature that, again, favors, you might say, the well-to-do, or at least the long-term homeowner, and that is that after age 55, you can sell your home and keep your old assessment if you buy a new home. And so that does relieve the lock-in effect to some extent, but it also, as you can see, again, discriminates and kind of in favor of those people who already have accumulated wealth.
To jump in on just a technical feature of that provision, that provision only allows you to buy and sell within the same county, as I understand, and it has to be less than the market rate. Has to match the market rate of the original that you bought at, which if you are selling a $3 million house in Palo Alto and you can buy within the same county, but you must find a house that sells for $120,000, it's just not going to happen. So that's a moot point in practice is what I understand.
I see.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of a thing. It's a policy that makes sense. It just doesn't work. It just that small issue. Something that was brought up during the case. So actually, here's something you quote. This is by a senator. "Don't tax you. Don't tax me. Tax that fellow behind the tree." There's no need for either of us to be harmed. Let's have someone else have the burden placed on them. This was brought up by John Paul Stevens during the court case, and I'll quote from it. "And that choice has inevitably placed a burden on a different group of people." Actually, I'm going to cut in some of the audio, so I'm going to play this. And then the Rex E. Lee, who is defending Prop 13 here, says,
"But Justice Stevens, if the new test is, does it place a different burden on some other people, then the Equal Protection Clause is going to cut a swath through our federal and state taxation laws that's going to make Sherman's march through Georgia look like a Sunday picnic."
Do you think that kind of apocalyptic scenario of saying that if this is irrational, essentially all of our taxes are irrational, do you think that is valid, or do you think that's an overstatement?
Oh, no, that's a gross overstatement. Something that we should point out about the way the problems that California was experiencing that led to Proposition 13 are problems that have occurred all over the country at one time or another. That is, of property assessments, values going up rapidly and creating higher tax bills. And what other states and local government units have done, widely used system, is to basically put into the law a provision that says as assessments go up, rates must go down so that revenues can only grow at a certain measured amount, and usually of quite a small amount, say 1 or 2% a year. So in effect, you can create a non-discriminatory system that also doesn't let property taxes run wild. You just, as the valuations go up, you cause the rates to go down by a commensurate amount to keep the revenues more or less level with some inflationary increases.
I mean, you mentioned that was in place in Kentucky in the 70s, and actually the Prop 13 equivalent in Oregon that was been put in place in the last few decades does something somewhat similar in that the assessment is kept low, but it's kept low even if it's resold. So it certainly has its own issues, but you certainly can't put the discriminatory class of privileged people as a criticism. So it's true that there's alternatives, and something rejected by the court is the idea that California doesn't have to pick the best way to address this. They just need to pick one way, and that was the defense they did. To quote Scalia, and I'm going to cut this in too.
We have this new tax system. It's rough and ready. It's not perfect, but close enough for government work.
It largely depends.
Laughter. And is it close enough? Because it really is not a small issue of inefficiency and inequity in California. It was a big issue then, and in 2017, it's only gotten worse and worse. So I guess...
I think that would be one interesting way in which this issue might be brought back to the court system again, would be through the gathering of good data on just how disparate the tax treatment is of one individual as compared with another who are otherwise similarly situated. When Proposition 13 was being decided, or when Nordlinger was being decided, the court used this example. There was a Malibu home worth $2.1 million that was being assessed at the same level as Stephanie Nordlinger's home, which was worth $150,000 or something like that, because they were both purchased for $150,000 at the time they were acquired. And so you had a home that was more than 10 times more valuable than hers, and the property owner paying the same level of tax. Well, probably you could find millions of examples of that now throughout California. So I would think the potential for demonstrating the unfairness of the tax scheme would be huge at this point in time.
Yeah, I mean, it was said that is there not a middle class, not the Malibu mansions and not the small things? What about the middle? And it was said there are no people in the middle, and it's only became more that case. There are $1 million homes, and there are renters who can't dream of having a home, and no one in between. And that's the effect of the processes this has created. Yeah, and
it's probably not only Proposition 13 that has led to that circumstance, but it certainly is a contributing factor, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's people who are, I guess, most involved in the housing circles around here certainly treat it as the biggest gorilla in the room. It certainly can't hold all the responsibility. To take a sideline, so something that was brought up in this is something that has come to our attention in the past and is, I guess, a certain hobby horse of ours, the Alaska oil dividend. The Alaska oil dividend, everyone in the state equally gets the proceeds of a certain amount accrued from a amount of natural resources that build a certain amount of equity. And in this case, I guess we always thought, oh, isn't this nice that they just were fair to everybody? And we should have known. Of course, they weren't. They originally gave old-timers, people who are in the state longer, more oil revenues, and people who are newer will get less. This was brought to the Supreme Court, Zobel versus Williams, in 1982, and they used the Equal Protection Clause to say this is not a constitutional way to divvy it up. You must actually divvy it up to everyone equally. And when Nordlinger went to the case, they tried to get this under the same scrutiny, which is to say, newcomers are not treated as well here. This is basically it discriminates against the right to travel. So, do you have anything to say about the kind of the original interpretation of the right to travel for Alaska and how this was interpreted here?
Well, as you probably recall, in Nordlinger, the Supreme Court declined to address the right to travel issue on the basis that Stephanie Nordlinger had not moved to California from out of state. She had resided in Los Angeles before she acquired her home. And so that issue is still sitting out there. In theory, one could bring a new case resting solely on the right to travel issue. But the point I was trying to make earlier is that I think if you wanted to try to relitigate Nordlinger v. Hahn, you would want to also gather data about just the disparate impact, the way in which similarly situated people are being treated differently all across the state on a massive scale. But certainly that right to travel issue is still out there and should be addressed at some point. I think the right to travel issue arises out of the Privileges and Immunities Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and I don't know that argument has been developed in many other cases, so I don't know how powerful an argument that would be.
But you mentioned in the 1993 paper that because it was thrown out on the grounds that Stephanie Nordlinger was only moving within the state, someone moving from out of the state within the state would have the right to travel justification for the equal protection. I mean, for basically taking this down. Yes. And it seemed to kind of, okay, did this happen? And it appears to be, I know none of, and it sounds like you know none of, a challenge under this basis.
No, it certainly has not made it to the U.S. Supreme Court if there was such a challenge. And I'm not aware that there has been.
Yeah.
So that issue, as far as I'm aware, is still out there and could be litigated. Of course, getting the Supreme Court to hear another challenge to Proposition 13 might be difficult.
Yeah, I guess it's tough to know exactly if something was ever tried and then lower courts would have just shot it down there and then. But it sounds very surprising that this obvious grounds has never been tried in decades, and I don't know exactly what the probability is for someone to mount that today.
Yeah, I don't know either. The constitutional scholars would generally tell you that that it's very difficult to win a rational basis scrutiny test case because the level of scrutiny tends to be very low. as you've already alluded to earlier on. And you add to that the Supreme Court is generally reluctant to reverse its own precedents. And so getting them to hear a case that they've decided once, a second time, and reconsider their opinion is not easily done. It seems to me, though, that in this particular case, one thing that argues in favor of it, though, is, as I pointed out, as we've discussed, this is a system of taxation that becomes increasingly discriminatory with the passage of time. It becomes increasingly harsh in its consequences. So that certainly argues in favor of revisiting it and reconsidering it. Something else to note about Proposition 13, by the way, is that it contained within it its own provision to lock it in, you might say. Proposition 13 was passed by a majority vote, voter initiative. It contained within it a provision that required a 2/3 majority, supermajority, we might say, to alter it thereafter. So it was kind of like they were pulling up the ladder on the way in by locking in these pernicious effects.
Drawbridge residents, they call them.
If a group of people wanted to take a shot at challenging Proposition 13, what do you think would be their best shot at doing so? If you were challenged with the task of leading such a campaign, what would you focus on given limited resources?
The things I would look at would be to see what public statistics there are available that would really help you highlight the discriminatory treatment. I would certainly also try to see if the discriminatory impact was related to such things as racial groups. Because as you know, there is a higher level of constitutional scrutiny for laws that are discriminatory based on race or sex or other suspect classifications. And so to the extent that you can show that this is really discriminatory in its impact with respect to racial minorities, for example, that might be a further reason for the court to examine the case and to examine it with a stricter level of scrutiny.
Yeah, I mean, it perpetuated to a large extent redlining and other discriminatory racial policies of decades previous. And it has made sure that these are structurally locked in to further them. And it sounds like that would be a case. Strict scrutiny.
But certainly reinforced the status quo, and so those people who were already advantaged were further advantaged, and so latecomers, which might include minorities, who may have had more difficulty, as you point out, in buying homes in the past and in the present, in terms of being able to obtain financing, for example. Those folks are coming into a system that is somewhat stacked against them.
Yeah, I mean, so strict scrutiny, you talk about protected classes. Yeah, that does not protect newcomers. Newcomers are not a protected class, and young people in that sense are not a protected class. But it does highly correlate with these. But I guess another grounds for scrutiny, and this is something just talking about a bad tax and who does it affect. Something Scalia brought up over and over again, it's what if you have a tax on milk? Is this discriminatory towards milk drinkers versus non-milk drinkers?
A jurisdiction chooses to tax milk. Doesn't have taxes on other kinds of food, but it chooses to tax milk. Is that bad?
I said there's
rational because they decided they want to tax milk. I can understand milk drinkers making this same argument, saying these people over here are drinking wine, it's just flowing like water, and we can't, a jurisdiction chooses to tax milk. Doesn't have taxes on other kinds of food, but it chooses to tax milk. Is that bad?
And it seems to kind of say, everything is going to have some sort of effect one way or another. But when you talk about land and housing, this seems like such a fundamental part of the costs of living that everyone pays. It sounds facetious in my mind to say that this is just something some people choose to consume and other people don't, like milk.
Yeah, not everyone drinks milk, but everyone needs a home.
So I guess as far as inviting strict scrutiny on housing, it sounds sort of strange that this isn't considered a fundamental, right in that sense that strict scrutiny would be able to touch on.
Well, to my mind, the way I would respond to Justice Scalia on that particular point would be to bring the focus back to the centrality of the base, of the tax base, to the fairness of a tax. I mean, you can tinker around the edges of taxes, and Congress does all the time in ways that some of us might think are fair or unfair. But when you make the very core of the tax, the very central feature of the tax, unfair, there's really no amount of tinkering that's going to fix that. And so I think that his analogy is just a weak one. Something, as you point out, something that is sort of a discretionary consumption item is in no way similar to something that is as fundamental as having a roof over your head. And the whole tax itself is about property. And as I say, the original name of the property tax is ad valorem, according to value. And when you take the fair market value out of the equation, you've really eviscerated the whole logic of the tax.
Well, that's an argument against one of the policies we advocate for on the show, the land value tax. People will often say, well, it might have implementation problems. There could be this and that issue that causes these side issues. And the answer to that is it's better to do the right tax slightly wrong than to do the wrong tax perfectly.
That could be, yes, I agree. I mean, every tax has its own complexities and problems, and the property tax certainly has many issues. It doesn't correlate very well to liquidity, for example, because the person may own a lot of land and yet not have the cash with which to pay an immediate tax bill. Although, what we find historically is that income does tend to correlate with wealth, land wealth, but it doesn't necessarily have to in any given case. There are all kinds of problems with the property tax that would cause one to say, maybe we would be better off to focus more on income taxes and consumption taxes as a way to fund government. But if we're going to have a property tax, it ought to be constructed around a base that is at least has some modicum of fairness associated with it. And to my mind, that the acquisition cost base is there simply is no modicum of fairness there.
The property tax, it's a weird tax in that, at least many of us feel, it's a mixture of the best tax and the worst tax. It's a tax against land, and you mentioned that the property tax, is in a footnote of the paper, came into being in medieval Europe as a tax on land and the chattels used in agriculture. And it's tended to be moved to basically real property, non-movable, but also, to an extent, movable property. And the improvements on certain structures, that can seem to be the worst tax because, hey, why would you not want improvements in your life based on like Ramsey pricing and other economic senses? That part is considered bad, whereas the land part is considered, at least in some metrics, very efficient. So it's a strange tax that combines two very disparate things, for what it's worth.
Yeah, I mean it's a tax with many challenges. For example, if you tax primarily real property, then the people who put most of their wealth into say stocks and bonds are really avoiding the tax, and so in a sense it becomes a tax disproportionately on landowners, that anomaly is on wealth. Another big problem is that it doesn't really take into account debt. And so some people might own a piece of real estate with a large mortgage, and their tax base would normally be fair market value. So you would be taxing them on the value of property in which they have actually very little equity. So there are all kinds of conceptual and practical challenges with the property tax. But to me, the difference with the acquisition cost base that that Proposition 13 created was that it created a base that really is almost like a number that comes out of the sky after a while. Because what relationship does what a property was worth in 1978 have to do with the tax liability computed in 2017? Really almost none. And yet that's the system that has been created.
To quote you in your own paper, you say that this has shifted the tax burden on an arbitrary basis of "I was here first." This is sort of an exercise in naked preference. Equal protection clause was enacted to prevent. I got there first. We see this in all sorts of schemes. We see this in property rights in water in the western United States. We see this, of course, in land acquisition. And yeah, it really tends to be an arbitrary basis that we take for granted, and seems to violate the ideas of horizontal equity and so much more. I know Jake has something he wants to say here.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you were worried to some degree about the progressivity of something like a land value tax, but if you look at the fact that land in the city center is exponentially more valuable than anything in the suburbs or in the more outlying areas, I think you would find that people that owned property outside of those urban cores would pay exponentially less, and they would probably pay absolutely less than they do now. Maybe not in California, where there's so much distortion as a result of Prop 13. And then you mentioned something else about it causing people to put more money in stocks and bonds. And I actually think this would be a very good thing, because investing in stocks and bonds actually helps to allocate capital where it needs to go. But when you, for example, just own a vacant lot, that allocation of money to that investment isn't actually doing anyone any good. It's not actually producing anything. So,
well, certainly to the extent that Proposition 13 discourages the property from changing hands, it's certainly an argument. There's certainly an argument there that it's economically inefficient as well, in addition to its other problems.
To look at possible, consequences of, what if this was retried again? People in California tend to say the fact of, we have, made such a mess of things with Prop 13 and other policies that if it was overturned now, it would be chaos. And I guess is that something the Supreme Court would ever has historically shied away from? Is the idea that because now people have this kind of, you could say, arbitrary privilege, you can't take away that privilege now, because it would lead to chaos and just suddenly, just everything would be topsy-turvy. Is that something that the Supreme Court is a concern to them?
Well, there might be occasions on which disruption to the present order would serve as the basis for saying we're not going to change things. But here, when the present order is so fundamentally flawed, I think what you would much more, the court would be more likely to do is to say, well, here's the problem. This problem is unconstitutional, and the legislature now needs to examine it and come up with a constitutional solution. And so, in other words, there would still be the opportunity to transition to something fairer, And as I've mentioned earlier, what most states have done with this problem of rapidly increasing property values is they simply enact what we call a compensating tax rate, which goes down as assessments go up. And so if by going out and reassessing all the property in California and creating a new tax base based on fair market value, the system that is employed throughout the rest of the country, you could also, at that point, enact a tax rate that would cause the overall revenues not to increase significantly. Basically, it'd be revenue neutral. It would just more fairly apportion the tax cost, the present tax cost, among the present population. And certainly there would be some people whose tax bills would go up dramatically, but only because they've been getting such a sweet deal for so long.
One other thing you could do to make it fair, not just between the current owners and people who want to become owners, but you could also make it fair for people that don't own land by combining this with a UBI or citizens dividend. And instead of actually decreasing the tax rate, you could basically just, either give people the money or say, all right, we're applying just this excess revenue over and above the neutrality to your tax bill, so that whatever averages out as everyone's dividend, that will just be a decrease in your property bill, and that would largely achieve the same, I think, valuable things that you're talking about.
It'd be a standard deduction for your property tax and sorts.
Right, exactly.
I would have to look at that more closely before I could comment. But my own inclination would be to think that fixing the base so that it is fair is a separate issue from then determining how much revenue do we want from this particular tax. And that was the problem with Nordlinger v. Hahn, in my opinion. The reason the court got it wrong was that it looked at it used the tax freeze sort of components of Proposition 13 to justify its discriminatory components. And if it had separated those out, it would have had a much harder time really justifying its position.
One technical issue, which is actually a pernicious but kind of thing that's invisible, is when you lock in people into their homes, it has a second-order effect. You have less of a supply, and then the prices go up, which leads to their land wealth going higher and higher. So it is kind of a strange case where these people, their homes are worth millions of dollars largely because of the tax system, because it keeps the supply so artificially low, which is one major issue. And there's something...
yes. That could well be.
And there's one thing Stephen says in this. Of course, there's another solution for those elderly people who found themselves, their $10,000 homes worth $1 million. They could sell their homes and still live. And it seems like there's kind of a false neutrality, that the idea of someone being, forced to make $1 million selling their home is, the one basis you should judge a community power to affect a tax policy as.
I felt, as I was considering this, that one of the things that people are overlooking is that these higher assessments, which were leading to bigger tax bills, were also reflective of greatly increased wealth of one form or another. And so these people who are being protected, in a sense, are being protected because they are becoming wealthier. In a sense, the system is really functioning to insulate the rich from the consequences of growing richer.
Yeah, and they can still refinance. They can still draw upon that wealth. They are not only on paper. It is very real wealth that they can actually, and that's one more alternative. They could roll up their tax schemes into their actual wealth and pay it off, at some later time if they actually have a wealth. They have, by definition, ability to pay.
And they have an easier time starting a business, getting loans, because they can use their properties as collateral, whereas renters don't have that option.
Mm-hmm. Well, and simply put, also, they have the benefit of living in a more valuable property which would, if rented out, rent for more value, for a higher rate of rent. So in other words, if you judge it from the standpoint of saying, well, if they had to go out and rent a place, they would have to pay more money than they are currently paying. They are receiving an immediate value simply in terms of that imputed rental value.
Yeah, a tax on location is a tax on consumption. You're consuming that location when you choose to have that property. And
Yes.
Yeah, I will quote, I guess, in full something you say after this. In saying this, I recognize that even a tax system which is sound in its fundamental principles will produce some unfairness in practice. This has always been true of the property tax. However, a tax system that is corrupt in its basic theory assures pervasive unfairness. This is a significant difference. And yeah, and I gotta say, there's a lot of, this paper's a barn burner in a lot of ways, and I really love how you tie in the fundamental importance of horizontal equity by saying just how fundamental it is to the normative standards of our culture. You mentioned the Equal Protection Clause in the Constitution. You mentioned the Golden Rule. You mentioned Kant's categorical imperative, and you mentioned the Rawlsian veil of ignorance. These are all different ways of just saying what we do has always been considered. It has to be fair, and it seems, and people now in California are feeling this idea of they call it neo-feudalism, and it feels that way. We have a protected class of squires, and it seems like, isn't the Supreme Court? Isn't this their job? It sounds and I can see why there's so much energy in this paper.
Yes, I'm not a constitutional scholar by training. I'm a tax professor, and so I normally write about tax matters primarily. And when I mentioned to a friend of mine that I was going to write this piece, who is a constitutional scholar, he said, "No, I don't think it's worth your time." But when I looked at this, I thought this is one of the gravest errors I've ever seen the Supreme Court make in a tax matter, and that I felt it needed to be addressed. And I think you're right that this is one of those situations where the very essence of our system of government is called into question when something as pernicious as this is allowed to stand. The Supreme Court really punted on something that I think was of fundamental importance. I think we're fortunate that, by and large, Proposition 13 has not spread to other states. But you can see that there's a tremendous incentive for present voters to vote themselves a benefit here, saying, I already own my home. I want to fix my tax liability for all time at a low level, and I'm not going to worry about what happens to anybody after me. And I can, if I'm wealthy enough, I can always pass my home on to my children so they keep my low tax assessment. So it really does have kind of a feudal component.
That's been a underlying thread of just basically the kind of school of thought of Henry George is you don't make progress by trying to make a coalition of people who just work in their best interest. You apply to everybody an idea of fairness, and this is when you have the golden rule. This is such a powerful thing that you can actually you can move mountains when you have people look at just general ideas of fairness. And when politics says fairness doesn't matter, it's irrelevant how politics works. I think that's why it certainly resonates with us certainly.
Yes, well, it is to me, it was just a stunning decision because it as I noted the article, and as you kind of pointed out already, the notion of treating others as you would treat themselves, as you would have them treat you, is an idea that crosses almost every major culture in the world and has for centuries. It's Confucius, it's Aristotle, it's the Bible. All say this same basic message that we should treat others as we would have them treat us. And to say that we're going to have a system where one person gets to grab who happens to be that person who presently is advantaged, gets to permanently enshrine that advantage, while others pick up the slack for them. That's just, to my mind, a corrupt system.
Well, it looks like we're wrapping up on time. I just want to thank so much Professor Jack Miller for making the time to talk about Nordlinger versus Hahn here on the Henry George program today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Past episodes of the Henry George program are available on seethecat.org, where you can also check out the EarthSharing.org newsletter and more. Case Issue Stanford.